sort of picaresque, mischievous. And this takes place in another city called Mantua, right? It's not in Florence, but it is a later application of linear perspective. We then have the Sandro Botticelli painting, which is also a Florentine painting, and this painting is completely different from anything we have seen or that we have been discussing up to now. But the main aspect of this painting is that it's a mythological story. It is not, we haven't really discussed anything that is truly mythological up to this point. We have looked at a lot of religious art, which was by far the one that predominated. We have looked at the use increasingly of forms to represent spatial recession and linear perspective. But now we have here a painting that seems to contradict all of that, and it is a painting that represents a mythological story. This is Venus, the goddess of love, right? And we are talking here about like romantic or sexual love. She's very beautiful. She wears these garments again that have this high waist and therefore make the belly kind of protrude. And so do all of the figures, right? The three graces. So you can tell that they are not really pregnant, but this is really the ideal of the time, right? This extended belly that is associated clearly with fertility. And the subject is very appropriate because this is Primavera or Venus, right? This is Cupid, her son, another cherub, just like the ones we saw in the painting, the previous painting, except that of course he's blindfolded and he represents love. He shoots arrows at people and he seems to be shooting at the three graces. This is again Mercury, right? A god associated, as I have often read, with the Medici themselves. All right. At any rate, he's this handsome young man, and he's somewhat not nude, but not very covered either. So that's something about him. And then we have this story here of the god wind, the wind god Zephyrus, and then Chloris, and then Flora, who is actually spring. And again, the idea is that this god essentially impregnates, takes, and some say rapes this goddess, and then eventually she becomes, she flowers, right? Which makes sense. The painting is very, very decorative. And this is very significant because, again, just it really goes against the trend in Florentine art that increasingly focuses on naturalism. So here we have this predominance of flowers. By the way, these are the flowers that did grow in Florence. Predominance of flowers and decoration on the dress, all of which flattens the representation. The figures are really having that Gothic convention of the tilted head, all of them, right? Except this one, but look at that. This one here, right? So we have that that convention of medieval art, and there is then truly any linear perspective at all. So it's almost like Botticelli is contemporary to the other artists that we have been studying, particularly Masaccio, and nevertheless he seems to be engaging into a style that is essentially of the past. Nevertheless, he is using mythological stories. That is Greco-Roman stories. Venus, Mercury, the three graces, all of these gods are the gods of the Greco-Roman tradition, right? They are represented in this new style or new old style, but nevertheless they are the gods of the Greco-Roman tradition. So he is bringing the Renaissance, right? The rebirth of the classical tradition, meaning Botticelli. He's bringing the rebirth of the classical tradition in a different way. Not the drapery that we have been looking at, not the contrapposto necessarily at least, but rather this subject matter, the mythological subject matter. And then this is an allegory. This is not really a story in the traditional sense. We don't have a narrative. The meaning here is that each of these figures or groups of figures kind of cumulative convey the meaning of spring, right? That's what an allegory is. It's a symbolic illustration of a concept or principle. The concept of principle is spring, and it is illustrated with this summation of figures in a way that are in this work, but it's not really a story. It's not that each of them is doing something that takes to something else, right? So it's very different. I'm going to interrupt here and see how this recording is going, and I will get back and do a second one with the images that remain. Well, no, actually I'm just going to finish. I think we have one more. Okay, so the last one that we have is the Paolo Uccello, and then this is Paolo Uccello, Niccolo da Tolentino leading the charge. Here we have, again, as was explained in the video, this sort of two trends, right? The decorative, medieval trend, even with decorative, with all this, for example, ornamentation of the horses and the headdress, or the hat, you could call it, of Niccolo da Tolentino. Niccolo da Tolentino was a condottieri, right? Was a mercenary soldier who had led this battle of the Florentines against Siena. He had led to a victory, and then he was given some recognition and even some land. But the main thing about this painting is that it is an amazing representation of linear perspective in action. So if you remember the painting called The Delivery of the Keys to St. Peter, that is a painting where linear perspective is used statically, right? It's a very, very static representation. And now the challenge was to, in a way, adapt linear perspective to these other uses, let's say a battle scene, in which, of course, nothing is still. And so what we have here are these broken spears on the ground that they are creating the orthogonals, right? It's fascinating, really, how he did it. And then, more importantly, there is a continuation. If you look at this, for example, we have this spear here, and then if we were going to let our eyes lead us, we see that it continues like that, and then it kind of continues on this slope, right? And this, I'm sorry, I'll get back to that. Okay. Here. Okay, so the slope continues like that, right? So again, we have kind of a combination of the spear that then continues like that, and then it has the winding line, right, that we talked about in the Masaccio, and then more of those winding lines that are parallel, and all of it contributes to leading our eyes into the background. We even have a figure here that is really treated in an awkward way, right, as if it's lying on the ground, or laying on the ground, and then we have the body that becomes wider, but we also see the feet coming towards us, so it's a kind of foreshortening. The same thing with the buttocks of the horses. We have all these horses in various points of view. They give us various parts of their body, and so that contributes to the sense of action. And then finally, we have these spears that lead our eyes into the background, but also animate the composition. They make it far more dynamic, and they bring that sense of action. Lots of curves with the banners, right, that were brought into the battlefield. And then diminution, those small figures in the background, they seem to be fighting in the countryside, right? So we have the main scene in here, but then these smaller figures here allow that sense of distance, which again is emphasized by these winding lines and then these orthogonals that are given to us by the spears on the ground. And this is the Battle of San Romano. And again, he was a condottieri. Okay, well, that takes care of it. Bye.